Moving on to chapter 3, which is accounting cycle, accruals and deferrals. In this chapter, you will learn that we record revenue when it is earned. For example, when a hairdresser cuts a customer's hair, revenue is earned when the hair is cut and the fee is collected. Timing differences. For most companies, revenue is not always earned as cash is received, nor is an expense necessarily incurred as cash is disbursed. Timing differences between cash flows and the recognition of revenue and expenses are referred to as accruals and deferrals. और इस चैप्टर में हम देखेंगे किस तरह से अकाउंटिंग इन्फॉर्मेशन जो है ना उसको आपको एडजस्ट करना पड़ता है accruals और deferrals के लिए prior to the preparation of financial statements. Step 4 in the accounting cycle. We covered in the first 3 steps of the accounting cycle in chapter 3 जिसमें हमने record की थी transactions, post की थी and prepare किया था trial balance. Need for adjusting entries. Certain transactions affect the revenue or expenses of 2 or more accounting periods. Adjusting entries are needed at the end of each accounting period to make certain that appropriate amounts of revenue and expense are reported in the company's income statement. Categories of adjusting entries. Most adjusting entries fall into one of 4 general categories: converting assets to expenses, converting liabilities to revenue, accruing unpaid expenses and accruing uncollected revenue. अब हम इसको स्टार्ट करते हैं फॉर्मली चैप्टर को. Converting assets to expenses. A cash expenditure or cost that will benefit more than one accounting period usually is recorded by debiting an asset account, for example supplies, unexpired insurance and so on, and by crediting cash. The asset account created actually represents the deferral or the postponement of an expense. In each future period that benefits from the use of this asset, an adjusting entry is made to allocate a portion of the asset's cost from the balance sheet to the income statement as an expense. This adjusting entry is recorded by debiting the appropriate expense account, for example supplies expense or insurance expense, and crediting the related asset account, for example supplies or unexpired insurance. अब liabilities को revenue में किस तरह से convert किया जाता है? A business may collect cash in advance for services to be rendered in future accounting periods. Transactions of this nature are usually recorded by debiting cash and by crediting the liability account, typically called unearned revenue or customer deposits. Here, the liability account created represents the deferral or the postponement of revenue. In the period that services are actually rendered or that goods are sold, an adjusting entry is made to allocate a portion of the liability from the balance sheet to the income statement to recognize the revenue earned during the period. The adjusting entry is recorded by debiting the liability, unearned revenue or customer deposits, and by crediting revenue earned or a similar account for the value of the services. Now, accruing unpaid expenses. An expense may be incurred in the current accounting period even though no cash payment will occur until a future period. These accrued expenses are recorded by an adjusting entry made at the end of each accounting period. The adjusting entry is recorded by debiting the appropriate expense account, for example interest expense or salary expense, and by crediting the related liability, for example interest payable or salaries payable. Now, accruing uncollected revenue. Revenue may be earned or accrued during the current period even though the collection of cash will not occur until a future period. Unrecorded earned revenue or for which no cash has been received requires an adjusting entry at the end of the accounting period. The adjusting entry is recorded by debiting the appropriate asset, for example accounts receivable or interest receivable, and by crediting the appropriate revenue account, for example service revenue earned or interest earned. Adjusting entries and timing differences. In an accrual accounting system, there are often timing differences between cash flows and the recognition of expenses or revenue. A company can pay cash in advance of incurring certain expenses or receive cash before revenue has earned, and likewise it can incur certain expenses before paying cash, or it can earn revenue before any cash is received. ये जो टाइमिंग डिफरेंसेस होते हैं और जो एडजस्टिंग एंट्रीज इनसे निकलती हैं, इनको हम अगर देखें तो एडजस्टिंग एंट्रीज जो हैं वो एसेट्स को कन्वर्ट करती हैं एक्सपेंसेस में, बिकॉज कैश जो है वो आपको बाद में पे हो रहा है और आपका एक्सपेंस पहले इनकर हो रहा है। एडजस्टिंग एंट्रीज लायबिलिटी को रेवेन्यू में कन्वर्ट करती हैं कि आपको कैश पहले रिसीव हो रहा है और आपकी रेवेन्यू बाद में अर्न कर रहे हैं आप, बिकॉज आप सर्विस बाद में पे कर रहे हैं। एडजस्टिंग एंट्रीज जो है वो अनपेड एक्सपेंसेस को एक्रू करता है, रिजल्ट फ्रॉम एक्सपेंसेस बीइंग इनकर्ड बिफोर कैश इज़ पेड। आपका एक्सपेंस आ गया है बट कैश हैज़ नॉट बीन पेड येट। और एडजस्टिंग एंट्रीज एक्रू अनकलेक्टेड रेवेन्यू, रिजल्ट फ्रॉम रेवेन्यू बीइंग अर्न बट कैश बिफोर कैश इज रिसीव। रेवेन्यू आपने अर्न कर लिया लेकिन अभी आपको उसके पैसे नहीं मिले। और रेवेन्यू अर्न करने का मतलब है कि आपने सर्विस या गुड जो है जो भी इट इज़ रेंडर्ड बट यू स्टिल हैवंट रिसीव द कैश फॉर इट। Adjusting entries are needed whenever revenue or expenses affect more than one accounting period, and every adjusting entry involves a change in either a revenue or expense and an asset or liability. Now, converting assets to expenses. इसमें हमें इंश्योरेंस पॉलिसी की एग्जांपल दी कि ऑन मार्च 1 ओवरनाइट ऑटो सर्विस परचेज अ 1 ईयर इंश्योरेंस पॉलिसी फॉर 18,000 और 1,500 उनकी मंथली इंश्योरेंस एक्सपेंस थी और 18,000 इंश्योरेंस पॉलिसी थी जो कि 12 मंथ को कवर कर रही थी। इसमें हमारा जो जर्नल में एंट्री क्या बनेगी कि अनएक्सपायर्ड इंश्योरेंस आपका डेबिट हो जाएगा और कैश आपका क्रेडिट हो जाएगा। इसी तरह ऐसा पे कॉन्सेप्ट ऑफ डेप्रिसिएशन है कि वो सिस्टमैटिक एलोकेशन ऑफ द कॉस्ट ऑफ द डेप्रिसिएबल एसेट टू एक्सपेंस। यहाँ पे ये उससे कुछ प्रैक्टिस क्वेश्चंस हैं जिनको हमने सॉल्व किया हुआ है। Then we have the matching principle, which underlies such accounting practices as depreciating plant assets, measuring the cost of supplies used, amortizing the cost of unexpired insurance policies, and all end of the period adjusting entries involve expense recognition or applications of the matching principle. Matching costs क्या होती हैं? Direct association of cost with specific revenue transactions. The ideal method of matching revenue with expenses to determine the actual amount of expense associated with specific revenue transactions. However, this approach works only for those costs and expenses that can be directly associated with specific revenue transactions. Commissions paid to salespeople are an example of costs that can be directly associated with the revenue of a specific accounting period. फिर मटीरियलिटी का कॉन्सेप्ट क्या हो जाता है कि एक रिलेटिव इंपॉर्टेंस क्या है एक आइटम की या एक इवेंट की। An item is considered material if knowledge of the item might reasonably influence the decisions of users of financial statements. Accountants must be sure that all material items are properly reported in financial statements. Immaterial items are those of little or no consequence to decision makers. Financial reporting process should be cost effective, that is, the value of the information should exceed the cost of its preparation, and immaterial items may be handled in the easiest and most convenient manner. अब मटेरियलिटी एंड एडजस्टिंग एंट्री से कॉन्सेप्ट को देखा जाए तो बिजनेसेस परचेज मेनी एसेट्स दैट हैव अ वेरी लो कॉस्ट और दैट विल बी कंज्यूम्ड क्विकली इन बिजनेस ऑपरेशंस। एग्जांपल्स इंक्लूड जैसे वेस्ट बास्केट्स हो गई, लाइट बल्ब्स हो गए, जैनिटोरियल सप्लाईज हो गया। मटेरियलिटी कॉन्सेप्ट परमिट्स चार्जिंग सच परचेजेस डायरेक्टली टू एक्सपेंस अकाउंट्स rather than to asset accounts. This treatment conveniently eliminates the need to prepare adjusting entries to depreciate these items. फिर हमारे पास आ जाता है प्रोफेशनल जजमेंट. Whether a specific item or event is material is a matter of professional judgment. In making these judgments, accountants consider several factors. कि ऑर्गेनाइजेशन का साइज़ क्या है, cumulative effect of numerous immaterial events, nature of the item and dollar amount of the item. Thank you. This was end of chapter 4, and if you have any questions